You go from a life of adventure and endorphins to, shuffling around your house to graduating to small walks on the sidewalks outside for PT. If you're going to play at a certain level, you also need to train and rest at that same level.
Welcome back to episode 117 of the podcast. And okay, if you guys are listening and if you are currently experiencing things like devastating effects of an injury and it's either limited or stopped your outdoor hobbies, this is going to be a great episode for you. We're going to talk with one of my friends who's going to tell his story about debilitating back pain, but how he beat it without surgery and he's back functioning at a high level. So welcome to the podcast, Kyle. What's going on, man?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chad. So I guess we can intro into how it happens and go from there.
Absolutely. Before we get into that, I want to, because I love this juxtaposition, especially with, I want people to know how active you are. So what are like the things you love to do and are good at? I know there's a bunch of things you do. So just lay it out for the audience. What do you love to do? What really gets you going? What do you do in summer, fall, winter when you're healthy?
Sure. I'm just a person that's stoked on life, and the way I like to express that is through outdoor sports. Like my relationship with the mountains and outdoors in general is very important to me personally in my life. And so basically, everything kind of revolves around doing different types of activities. And I guess it's hard to throw it out in a few sentences, but for the most part, downhill mountain biking, rock climbing, and skiing are at the forefront of everything. And so, how my seasons look is basically every season revolves around a specific activity or a location, right? Because like best climbing season is going to be during like fall, spring. Summer is going to be the downhill mountain biking season. Winter is obviously skiing. And then spring, I pull double duty because spring is also the ski mountaineer season, along with some of the better rock climbing, right? And then also summer also doubles as alpine climbing. Generally, yeah, my year to year is basically centered around what activity do I want to do during this period of the season. And I like to go out and climb. For rock climbing, of course, I like cragging, but really my true love with that is going to be around doing like free climbing big walls, going out and up at 510 to like 511 minus area, like for anything between 500 to 1500 feet. That's like my bread and butter with climbing. So I'm like an adventure climber. That's what I would say is what I like to do in climbing. And then skiing is just a means to live out a childhood dream. So like when I was younger, I always saw the Red Bull videos and people skiing cool terrain. And it's like silly to say, but I was like, I want to do that. And so once I finally moved to a snow state, I jumped all into backcountry. And it's really just a means to live out my childhood dreams. And it's super fun. And so I guess that's really how my year to year looks. It just revolves around different seasons, different months, different locations, and between those three sports.
He's a busy guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, busy guy. And yeah, man, So actually, the first time I met Kyle, or when we hung out in person, was actually at a ski mountaineering trip, essentially at the Holy Cross, which, funny enough, is if we rewind to when you first started noticing your back pain, from what I understand, that was around the time it was. Can you tell us a little bit about what the first signs of it was and like how you dealt with some of those signs, and then how did it progress from that initial stage of pain? Like what happened?
Sure. Just to give a little background, Mountain of the Holy Cross, it's a really far out mountain, right? It's not like something that's exactly roadside. So I think round trip, it's around 27 or 28 miles if you actually go and ski it. And just to lead into like how I started noticing things is part of our plan was originally to do it in, I think 3 days. We wanted to do it in 3 days just to make it like a fun, comfortable experience and less suffering. But for whatever reason, I think that compounded down to 2 days. And so what that means is we were touring out there with overnight gear. So you've got ski equipment, crampons, ice axes, all your overnight gear to bivvy out in the backcountry at high elevation when still pretty cold temperatures in springtime. So we had quite heavy packs. I wouldn't be able to tell you the exact weight, but if I had to guess, we definitely had something in the neighborhood of like 50 to 65 pounds.
Sure.
I think that'd be a pretty accurate estimate of how much we brought out each. And so when I really started noticing it is I think when we laid down to bivvy the first night. So I think we went, what, maybe 10 miles
Yeah.
to the first bivy site. And when we finally stopped, I just noticed my legs were just getting super tight. Even though it's like a back issue, that's where I started noticing it first, was definitely in my legs. As at nighttime, they just got overly tight. And I was trying to, like, I was sleeping in a bivy sack and I was trying to stretch it out, like, throughout the night. We didn't really sleep much, maybe 1 to 2 hours that night,
Terrible. Yeah.
right? And then when we woke up the next morning, that's when I really felt it. When we decided to still go for the summit push, my legs just weren't working the way they were normally operate. I could just notice it step by step, but I think a lot of times we have this mentality to push through things and do it anyways. And at some point in that day, we decided that the objective wasn't going to happen. We just happened to get very poor travel conditions where the snow is so punchy that if you tried to ski on it, I think the area we were going up, it was, if we tried to skin up it, it was too steep to skin up. And then if you put on crampons, you were just punch holing through the snow, like knee
Yeah.
deep. It was just awful travel conditions. And so we ended up bailing off the objective. And at that point, I felt it like my legs were like totally toast. My upper body felt fine carrying all that weight. Like I'm a small frame, like I'm 5'6", like 140 pounds, but I'm relatively like strong for my size. So like the carrying the weight itself wasn't necessarily like a big issue. It's just all manifesting in my legs. Like my
Hmm.
legs were just getting overly tight, like they just felt weak, like they could buckle, things like that. So that's really when I really started noticing it quite a bit, is on that second day and starting up and then beginning to turn around.
So it was starting to. So great way to. First of all, great way to describe Mount of the Holy Cross. It was a fun trip, but yeah, it was a nightmare. That's when we learned that we needed ascent plates. That's probably what would have been the best move, I feel like, for that steep incline, but still punching through. If we
Hmm.
would have wore ascent plates on our crampons. So anyway, so there's that. But okay, so it started to progress. It was already progressing to your legs. Okay, so you got home from that trip then, which was, I imagine, a couple hour drive and stuff like that. And this was in the spring. This was May, right? So what happened from that initial getting it into your legs in May to then throughout the summer? Did it start to progress, or how did it keep manifesting for you?
Where I left off was like right when we were turning around, still 10 miles from the car, right? So, as you can imagine, my legs are already given out. We went another 10 miles back to the car. And it wasn't a fun experience going back. It wasn't anything out of the normal. But once I sat down and actually drove back to the house, like a 2 hour drive or whatever it is, I distinctly remember stepping out of my truck and my legs buckled.
Wow.
They just like totally gave out, and I was just like, wow, that was a really big day. I didn't really think too much of it at the time. I was, I'm pretty used to pushing my body and doing these really large objectives, and it's usually, yeah, we'll just take 3 to 5 days rest after something like that and bounce right back to it. But from what I recall, like obviously I took my rest after that and things weren't really feeling the greatest. But when you push your body all the time, there's usually something that just feels a little off or a little tired when it's just compounded one day after another. But I kept doing things like larger days. So that was springtime. And what kept happening is I kept wanting to do more ski mountaineer lines. I was just really stoked on just skiing as many big lines as possible. And I remember one day in particular, probably about maybe 3 weeks later, because I took a little time off after the cross because my legs they just felt bad. And I went to doctors and things like that, and they were just like, oh, you have an overuse injury, because the symptoms
Interesting.
hadn't necessarily showed up in my
Mm-hmm.
back yet. It's all manifesting in my legs. And so I went and tried to ski a 14er by myself. I went and tried to ski Gray's Peak, and off of Gray's Peak, there's this couloir called something Dogface or
Dead
something like
dog or
that.
something?
Yeah, Dead Dog. That's it. And so I
Mm-hmm.
was climbing the line, and I was halfway up the line, and my legs were just, they were not cooperating. So
Weird.
I got about halfway up the line, about 800 feet up the line or so, and then just transitioned to downhill, skied down. And skiing down was all right. But once I started having to hike again, I had to hike out because during spring, the conditions get a little mixy maxy. You're not always on skis. And I had to use my poles I strapped my poles to my right leg because my IT band is what was affecting me at that point, as the IT band was so tight that it hurt tremendously to bend my leg at all. And so I basically just limped out of skiing a 14er. And
Wow.
then after that, I gave up on skiing big lines because I was just like, this isn't going well, and it puts you at risk to not be functioning properly and trying to like. And so I just wound down for the spring season after that, and then just
But you're
transitioned
still
into
not
rock
aware,
climbing.
and at this point, Kyle, you're still not aware that anything really major is wrong. You're just thinking that you got a little tweak in your leg type of thing, or are you getting a little inkling that something might be more
I was starting
major?
to get an inkling that not necessarily something was major. What the doctor diagnosed me with is because this is all in my legs, remember, there's no back pain yet. There's nothing to indicate that it might be like a spine issue. And it's all in my IT band. And so they're just telling me, hey, it's an overuse injury. You're not going to injure yourself if you keep doing things. It depends on your pain tolerance. That's typically what they do with overuse injuries that don't have to do with grinding of bones. If your bone's grinding, they'll tell you not to do more of that. But if it's just
Sure.
like something's getting inflamed, like your IT band or what have you, they tell you, hey, you're not going to damage yourself, but it's just going to hurt. So that's what I'm thinking. That's what the doctors told me. So I didn't have anything else to think otherwise. And I didn't think anything was majorly wrong, but I definitely wasn't operating correctly. So there's definitely something going on, but I didn't think it was a spine issue at that time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So spring comes and goes, and you're walking out with a trekking pole on your leg
Yeah,
at this
like quite
point.
literally, I'm limping back to my car after trying to ski a
Wow.
14er. Yeah, like it was. I was like at that point, I was just like, I have no business trying to ski big lines anymore. So
Right.
I wrapped up my spring mountaineer season, and that was probably in. That's actually a lie. I kept skiing. So I stopped skiing like big lines that required climbing with ice axes and crampons, like things that are
Yes.
very leg intensive. And then so yeah, I went back to smaller days. It's more so like I changed my tactics instead of trying to go and do these like really large days where you have to travel across a lot of miles. There's this place called Rollins Pass, and once the road clears for that, you can pretty much park at the top, just ski down your line, and then you come back up and you're at the cars again. So like I started doing things like that, crag style with climbing, like things that don't require like a lot of leg effort. Because climbing in general as a sport, I find it to be like very healthy on your body, minus bouldering. I would not say the same thing for bouldering. Bouldering is
Totally.
very aggressive on your body,
Yeah.
but like rope climbing in particular is very static and healthy for your joints. And so I didn't really have much issues like climbing hard. Like I was still able to climb
Hmm.
512, 511, no problem. It was more so the walking. Anything that required me to
Interesting.
yeah, hike or do anything large like that. So I started avoiding that and just went about it and took time off from like really large days. But
Yeah.
then summer rolls around, right? And so summer's my favorite season. That's when I get to go alpine climbing, which requires large days. And I started feeling a little bit better by then. I wasn't having as bad of inflammation in my legs. I wasn't getting like the major IT band issues. Like I'd still wake up every day and have to do a tremendous amount of foam rolling and stretching.
Hmm.
I don't want to say that like things were back to normal. It was more like my legs weren't giving out on me, but I had to put a lot of body maintenance in, stretching, foam rolling, etc., in the mornings in order to go do my thing throughout the day. And that was still a painful experience, that stretching and foam rolling, not like normal stretching. It's very painful, but it would enable me to be able to still go and do big days as long as I stayed on top of that. So that's what I was doing. I was taking rest for a period, and then I started to get back to things in summer. And so I started alpine climbing out in Rocky again, and I didn't really have any major issues. My legs weren't giving out on me. Things seemed to be better. But I do distinctly remember on one of the pitches of one of the climbs I was doing, it was a hanging belay. And so if you don't know what a hanging belay is, it's where you don't have a ledge, you're just free hanging off the side of a cliff on an anchor. And so
I
that's
hate
very
those.
heavy. Yeah, it's not the most comfortable.
Uh,
Uh, and yeah, the harness pulls up directly on your lower back, and I distinctly remember feeling like a burning sensation. And I didn't think too much of it at the time because hanging belays, they're never really that comfortable. And as soon as I moved out of the belay and started climbing again, like it just went away totally. But that was probably the first sign of anything to do with my back, was
wow.
that like specific moment. And it's weird that I remember it like that pinpoint moment, but yeah, that's the first time I felt like something in my back, not my legs. And just fast forward a little bit, is like fall starts to come around, and I was out climbing off of Independence Pass, which is like roadside climbing in like higher elevations. And I remembered my stretching started to get really bad, meaning like when I woke up in those mornings around then, this is probably about October, early October, I'd wake up, I'd start stretching, and I was like screaming while stretching. It was very painful.
Was it both
um,
legs or was it just one leg at this point? Or
Both
Always were.
legs, but most of it was in my right side.
Sure.
Yeah, they both were like my legs were running like overly tight. So just to give a pretty good description is not just the IT band, but glutes, calves, quads, just like everything was just
Yeah.
like unnaturally tight. And so when I
Mm-hmm.
went to doctors, I was still going to doctor visits throughout all this just to get check-ins and being like, hey, this is still going on. And they're still telling me the same things. Hey, this is an overuse injury and you run overly tight. And because it's an overuse injury, things are getting inflamed. So they're like, it's somewhat normal. And I don't want to make it sound like I didn't take rest or didn't follow up on these things, but I was on top of it because, as I explained before, like my relationship with these sports and mountains is really important, right? So I had good care of myself. I was following up, doing all that, and from the medical knowledge I was receiving, everything was
Exactly.
okay. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
right. And during this October period when I was out doing this climbing, the stretching started to get really painful. And I was like, okay, something's really up. I went out and, did my normal. I did my stretches and I was able to get some mobility back. And then I'd go cragging. I was lead climbing, sport climbing, all that kind of stuff. And when I came back from that, it was like 2 days of it. It wasn't even that long. It was just a weekend. The next day I woke up. I couldn't get out of bed. Like if yeah, like I was bedridden, like totally decommissioned. And it was the most pain I've ever felt in my life. And it all then started radiating out of my back. And like it started nerve pain. It started shooting down into my legs from my low back. And then if I like coughed or sneezed, like I would cry. Like it was that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I first started understanding it's a spine issue. It's
Yeah.
in that moment. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so I imagine. Okay, so it seemed to be like a roller coaster. It got worse. Then it got better. Started to feel it again. October comes around, and now it just all of a sudden, bam! It like punches you in the face.
Oh yeah.
So, what was your mindset after that? Like how did going forward from that October when you woke up like that, and then going back to the doctors? How did your mindset shift on? I mean, I'm sure it probably shifted to, oh, this is more serious than I thought. And how did that start affecting your life and the sports you were doing from then on?
Oh, absolutely. After first, I had to deal with the initial onset of the pain, which I was bedridden for about 3 or 4 days. Quite literally, didn't get out of bed. I had friends coming to bring me food and stuff because I was like, "This is bad." I almost had my sister fly out just to come take care of me, but luckily, what ended up happening is it started to alleviate like a little bit. And when I say alleviate, it just means like I could get out of bed and like shuffle around a little bit. I could start moving again. And so after the bedridden period, I then went to the doctor because it was just too painful. Like I
Yeah.
wasn't going to be able to drive. And even if someone came to drive me, I didn't want to get out and get into a car and sit in it. Like I just didn't want to
Oh.
do all the change in postures. It was bad. And so, yeah, I went to the doctor and that as soon as I walked in, the first doc was just like, "Hey, you definitely have a disc herniation based on what you're telling me and everything that I'm seeing." And he gave me my choices. And at first, what that doctor told me was, "Hey, you don't even need an MRI because unless I'm going to do surgery, I'm not going to take the MRI." And so I did what the doc said, and essentially, like with disc herniations, which by the way, I don't agree with that advice he gave, because what happens with disc herniations is you can either get a discectomy where they just cut you open and remove the herniated disc, or B, you just let father time take its course and your body eventually chews up that herniation,
Yeah.
and you can go back to normal. But the thing is, if you don't get an MRI, disc herniations can be really serious if they compress your spinal cord. So you can get permanent nerve damage, and in some cases like lose the ability to walk if like you had a compression on your spinal cord, because that's your spinal cord. That's the thing that if it gets cut, you can't walk anymore, right? So this is all in that same area. And so if the disc herniation compresses the cord, you can have really serious lifelong issues. I had to go to a lot of doctors to make sense of all this.
Right.
I would definitely start with an MRI with that type of thing. But
Yeah, I would imagine going through a lot of this, you had to figure out like where's your trust in kind of the healthcare system right now? Because one of my hardest things right now is knowing who to trust when I'm talking
mm-hmm.
to somebody, even somebody that's high up in the medical field and maybe he's been dealing with disc herniations and things like that. But sometimes their advice contradicts this advice. Then you see advice online What was it like navigating all of that type of stuff for you?
It's awful, to be quite frank, because my takeaway from the medical system when you're talking to doctors in specific is you typically have like two different types of doctors. You have like surgical doctors, and then you have, I forget the exact term for it, but basically natural remedy doctors, where
Mm,
they try not to recommend surgery unless it's like absolutely required. So you have these two different like schools of thought with doctors, right? And so if you go to a surgical doctor, the surgical doctor recommends surgery, and then basically they won't talk to you about like outside of surgery. And so what I ended up having to do is I went to multiple doctors. I went to two different surgical doctors, two doctors of the other type, just to, I was just trying to learn about what was going on, because this was really impacting me at this point. Like this was
yeah,
a, half a year total recovery, and like I was having trouble walking, where I'm very used to being very mobile, and I'm pretty healthy and fit. So like it
yeah,
seemed very out of the norm for me. And the mindset with this is just like you go from a life of adventure and endorphins to, shuffling around your house to graduating to small walks on the sidewalks outside for PT. So
humbling.
for me, it consumed my thoughts, right? This became my focus. There's definitely periods of like despair with this, right? It hits you. It's, will I be able to get back to what I was doing before? Because you just don't know. I'm not in the medical field. Like I don't really know how disc herniations work. I can just only go off of what I'm feeling and the amount of pain I was in, which was quite
Yeah,
a bit. And when you look at my MRI images, like herniations can take shape in a couple ways where, and just to go over the facts of what a disc herniation is, you have your spinal column, right? And in between your vertebrae, you have these discs, and these discs act as shock absorbers and things like that for your spine. And that's what these discs are. And a herniation is essentially when a piece of that disc starts to move outside the vertebrae. And then inside your spinal column, you have nerves. And when that disc lands on the nerves, it causes that crazy amount of pain and all the manifestation in your legs. That's what a herniation is. And, in reality, in terms of spine things, it's pretty low on the totem pole in terms of like how serious it is, just because it's your spine, right? But the way it manifests when it happens is in your life. Like you will definitely notice it. It definitely impacts everything you're doing. Everything's painful. And yeah, that definitely sent me down that rabbit hole of questioning, am I going to be able to get back to doing these things that I love?
how did you that because obviously you've made progress in this and awesome progress in this, so
Mm-hmm.
how did you, from my experience with what I think is a herniation, I find out I have an MRI next week, so the there's like good days and there's bad days with it. How did you know, some days you're in just total despair and then some days you're like, oh, I'm doing a little bit better, but the progress isn't, it doesn't seem to be very linear. It seems to be up and down and all around and in circles type of thing. So what, how did you maintain your mindset through this whole thing when you're not, like, the progress is so minimal, it seems?
Yeah, initially it wasn't pretty. I threw a little pity party.
Right.
Obviously, I get all into my head about it because it's really impacting my life. But at least for me, like my fight or flight response for this particular situation was after my small pity party was let's refocus all my efforts into learning and understanding like how this is affecting me and how to get back to where I was. And so that's where all my drive went to, was basically recovery and just like understanding what's going on. And yeah, let's see. Yeah, once I flipped into the recovery mode, I obviously had to talk to a number of doctors to understand how this even happened. Because like when I look at injuries, I don't just look at, okay, I am injured, here's how to recover. I also like to look at, I got injured. How did that happen? It's one thing if you like fall off a cliff or something, and it's you got injured because you fell off a cliff. But when you're talking about like overuse injuries or just like some injury along those lines, a lot of times it can also be related to your body mechanics, right? So for me, I found a pretty good physical therapist. And by the way, the biggest relief in the recovery periods was getting dry needled with electricity. So they'd
Oh,
put
was it?
needles. Yeah, that was the only thing that would actually relieve a lot of the nerve tension down in my legs, was getting dry needled and then sending electrical current down those needles.
Really?
So I met up with this physical therapist though, right? And so he started looking at my body mechanics, and my goal with him, my specific goal wasn't just like pain relief. What I wanted out of it was like, hey, I want to understand like how can I improve my body so that I don't re-injure myself in the same manner. So basically, I want to fix my deficiencies so that either I have a higher threshold before injury or it just doesn't happen again, right? And so what we ended up discovering was that one, I primarily do a lot of rock climbing. It's like my main thing. So like with rock climbing, your legs don't really matter pretty much. So I never trained my legs. And then on top of that, my core ended up being pretty weak. And what his diagnosis was that basically my mind body connection was weak to my abs, meaning like
Mm.
when I'm supposed to contract my abs, they don't, and my other muscle groups just compensate for them. Which at first I had a really hard time believing this because my favorite style of climbing is like completely upside down in caves, which is like known for you need ab strength to be able to hold those positions, and that's like my absolute favorite style of climbing. And so, yeah, it took a little bit, like basically he had to test me and I had to like see for myself to understand what he was saying. But yeah, sure enough though, we went through a process of highlighting my muscle deficiencies,
Mm.
and then designing basically physical therapy workouts to fix those areas of weakness. Because if you could imagine, what ends up happening is like for me in specific, I go on these really large days, and since I don't train my legs like I do the same way with my upper body and things like that, what will end up happening on these large days is my legs start to give out at some point in that excursion. And then if you've ever felt that feeling where your legs just feel a little wobbly on a really large day, like you can just feel like your legs are weaker, and then maybe they're not stepping the same way they would in the beginning of the hike. That's basically your leg muscle groups giving out. And so what ends up happening is your body mechanics start to change. So like your legs get really weak, and then you start moving differently in a way that's not healthy for other parts of your body, and in this case my back. Yeah, I had to go through a process of fixing all these weak muscle groups in order to create like a stronger platform to keep my back healthy. So it was a very long process of doing that. And the recovery was not instantaneous whatsoever. Of course, I had to ramp back up over time, just starting to increase the activity levels as I got more mobility back without trying to overdo it, basically.
Yeah. Was there, do you remember any exercises in particular that felt very helpful for you?
Like a lot of that's going to be very specific to the person, you know, in terms of like you definitely need to go see like professionals in terms of what a specific person needs to work on. But like for me in specific, ab workouts help tremendously because your abs protect your back. So if you're squatting, for example, like in on a barbell rack in the gym, you should be like contracting your abs while
Right.
you're doing that, and then that helps protect your spine. And that same thing goes for sports. If you're hiking up big mountains with packs on your back and stuff like that, and going really far distances and all that kind of stuff, like your abs protect your back from the weight being carried up. And so for me, really targeting abs made a gigantic difference with my back. And then on the flip side, improving my leg capabilities. Just squat. I started squats, front squats, one-legged knee stabilization. So like doing pistol squats on Boise balls with one leg
Mm-hmm.
to be able to strengthen your stabilizer muscles, because that's what would happen is my knees would get a little wobbly when my larger muscle groups would get pretty tired. So I
Yeah.
had to go, yeah, I had to do like a pretty big, basically my whole lower body and my abs was like the main target areas.
Now, was there a specific moment that you can recall when you were in your PT that you felt like you really had a breakthrough?
Uh, no, it was all pretty gradual because it's like you were saying before, where it's like a roller coaster, and
Okay.
the recovery went like that too. It's one week I would have so much more mobility than like previous weeks, and then
Wow.
I go out and I go and have fun with some limitations on myself. Like I started setting little like personal limitations. If I went out skiing, let's say my normal ski day is 6 hours, and I ski 20,000 downhill vertical at a resort.
Mm-hmm.
So usually at the end of that day, my legs are pretty tired, obviously. So during this recovery period, instead of doing that same thing where it's just like ski as much as possible and wipe my legs out, is like when my legs started to feel tired and I felt my technique on my skis getting a little worse because my legs are tired, I called it, that was my day. So I started
Nice.
listening to my body. Like that was honestly, that's probably one of that would be a good breakthrough, like just personally, is like instead of doing what I normally do and just like completely demolishing myself, is actually just listening to my body. If my body's starting to get a little tired, then it's time to call it quits. And so with doing
Love
that,
it.
I was able to protect my spine a lot more from having pain and then regressing backwards. It's stop before you get too tired, and then your form goes out the window and you're no longer protecting. So that was a big thing. But yeah, but more or less though, week to week it was different. This went on for a couple months where it's pretty sporadic. Like I was always like making progress, but then each week was different. Some weeks I felt really good. Some weeks I
Yeah.
went back a couple steps, had to take 5 rest days, etc. So it's pretty back and forth.
That I commend your mental fortitude for going through that, because I can imagine. I've been working with it now for the last month at least, and it can be frustrating to say the least when you're all over the place with that. So that's good on you for that. Uh, One of my last questions is, obviously I want to look at this because I'm in the throes of this right now. I want to be able to look at this next year, hopefully, and make sure that it's something positive that happened in my life, right? How do you feel like this whole situation impacted you positively? It sounds like, number one, you're starting to listen to your body a lot more. Was there
Hmm.
anything else that came along with that?
Yeah. So if we just fast forward to now, my whole mindset around these sports has changed. Like, I'm definitely not old by any means. Like, I'm 31 years old. But the reality is, as we get farther away from like our low 20s, like your body definitely recovers slower. I'm not saying we're old by any means, but it's just a that's just a reality of the thing is recovery takes more effort is like the big takeaway. And so nowadays, before this back injury, I just played a lot. I just played really hard in the mountains. And that was my training, was doing cool things in the mountains. I didn't actually have a training schedule or like a recovery schedule. And nowadays, it's like mandatory for me to have at least 2 training days a week, as well as 1 to 2 recovery days during the week, depending on what I'm doing. And then the other days are more reserved for playing or what I want to do. That's the biggest takeaway is actually putting time and attention into taking care of my body and then listening to what it wants. So I don't get really regimented in terms of my week to week. It's more like this week I'm feeling pretty crunchy.
Interesting.
Let me throw in a recovery day here because that's what like rest days where you're doing like yoga, stretching, all that kind of stuff. That stuff does wonders for me because I can't sit here and say that my spine is back to where it was in terms of herniations. Mine was pretty bad. And so I still have a lot of leg issues where things just get unnaturally tight. And then if I let it stay tight, then I get back pain. The biggest takeaway from all this and how I approach things differently nowadays is I look at it as I have a finite amount of energy that I can, use my body for, meaning like you can only do this much in a week, right? And so I'm more particular about how I spend that time, and I do not skip on my training and rest days because if you're going to play at a certain level, you also need to train and rest at that same level. That's the
Ooh.
the biggest away with from all this
Ooh.
is dedicating time to that and not like making excuses with it.
Ooh. Dude, we're going to clip that one for Instagram. That was good. That was good. I love that. You're inspiring me to look at this in a more positive light, Kyle. So I appreciate that. My last question for you, and this has been great. This has been great. My last question is for you is, if you could go back and give Kyle advice for a year ago before all this started happening, what would you say?
That's a hard question because the reality is you don't know what you need to know until like you felt the consequences to it. Like at least I'm hard-headed in
Totally.
terms of how I learned that way, but I think the biggest thing is the way I used to do things was just like big day after big day is, go for quality over quantity because a lot of people that, surround themselves with these outdoor sports and extreme sports in general, we have this go mentality where it's that old school thought where it's just like you got to go do it now and don't make excuses. I think the biggest thing is go for quality over quantity. So instead of saying
Mm.
yes to everything, say yes to the things that will actually be like an impactful experience after doing it versus just doing everything.
Ooh. Crushed it. Crushed it, man. Kyle, thank you so much. Where can people find you on Instagram? What's your name?
Yeah, I guess my handle at commander_Sicard.
Yeah, he's got some cool stuff on there. He's always where you just got back from what, China or something?
Yeah, so I guess with these last minutes, it'd be cool if we could talk about trips and plans.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I just got back from China. My girlfriend and I, we went for 3 weeks. The first week we did the touristy thing, which was definitely super cool. Like sometimes touristy things are looked at as like a bad thing, but when you go to the other side of the world, it's definitely worth
Sure.
experiencing the culture, right? But then the last 2 weeks of the trip was all dedicated to rock climbing, and so we went to the first place we went to is this place called Liebing, and that translates into English as dawn. So the place is called Dawn, and basically it's like it's hard to explain. If you saw pictures of these places, like they're not like they don't look real. Like it's basically like a samurai village with like giant sandstone walls coming out of a jungle. It's very hard to describe, but if you know climbing areas, it's if Indian Creek and Tennessee Wall had a baby in terms of the climbing. So it's sandstone splitter climbing with a lot of variations and big roofs and things like that. It's a trad climber's paradise and just like the most unreal setting. And so we spent 4 days there climbing walls and cragging, and then we went over to a place called Yangshuo, which is like the really large sport climbing area there, and it has all these I don't want to call them, they're almost like, but they're like everywhere, and they're just filled with limestone climbing, and you basically just ride scooters everywhere. Like you can't drive in China unless you have a Chinese driver's license in specific. So like you can scooter everywhere. So it's like you scooter to the crag, you go climbing, and then you scooter, get some food, scooter back to your bed. And it's just an awesome experience. So you go to the middle of nowhere Liming, and then you go over to the vacation-y vibe climbing over in Yangshuo. So that's what China looked like.
Dang, man. How did that get on your radar to go climb at?
So I saw an article in Climbing Magazine like 4 or 5 years ago about Liming. It was like this newly discovered trad place in China, and so not many people get to go there because to go to China, right, you got to go and get a travel visa and things like that. You can't just fly in. You got to go to the Chinese consulate and do all that kind of stuff. And so I saw this article 4 or 5 years ago, and it's like this new
Hmm.
discovered climbing location that's being developed, and it like raved about the quality of the climbing. And then when you see the pictures, it's just like these beautiful orange sandstone walls like coming out of a jungle, and it just looks unreal. And my girlfriend, she's a native to China, and so we've been talking about going to China, and so we put this trip together where it's let's go to the two major climbing areas in China, which is Liming and Yangshuo. And so that's how that happened.
Got you, dude. Wow. Amazing. Now, that's cool. What do you got planned for this upcoming year then?
Mm,
2025.
So the big trip that I've got my stoke for is I'm going to Alaska in April, and
Mm.
we're going with a team of about I think 6 or 7 people, and we're gonna fly into Valdez or Anchorage, Alaska, and then charter a plane out into Valdez, Alaska, and then camp on a glacier for 12 days, and then basically just like ski mountaineer lines for that 12-day period.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it's going to be real cool. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about is at like the forefront of my mind is in order to go on this trip, I got to stay injury free and then make sure I'm in physical
Totally.
capability to ski mountaineer for 12 days straight.
Yeah.
That's the one that I'm really excited about that's upcoming.
You could look at it as good thing it happened on the cross instead of in Alaska on a 12-day in the middle of a 12-day trip. Now the skills you need to be working on going into that. That's awesome, man. Cool. Everybody, that's Kyle Sicard right there. Love it. Great work. Guys, everybody that's listening, please leave a 5-star review on Spotify and subscribe on YouTube. We'll see you for the next one.